every baker needs to know this. Baking soda, baking powder, these are not the same thing. So in today's video, I'll be talking about exactly what these products are, why bakers need to use them, when to use them, and the differences between the two of them. Make sure to stick around to the end because I'll also be sharing with you how to check if your baking powder is good, how to check if your baking soda is good, especially if you've had it in the kitchen for a long time. So it's safe to say that one is definitely...
Hi everyone, this is Maureen Amari of Baking with Amari. In this channel, we share cake decoration tutorials, baking tips, and baking recipes. So if this is something you're interested in, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button.
So first, let's talk about cake making and raising and aeration. So in the baking world, there are various types of raising agents that are used. Some are natural and some are chemical. So for example, if I'm looking at natural raising agents, I'm talking about eggs. Like in sponge cake making, there's some sponge cakes where we don't use any type of chemical raising agents. We're only using eggs as the raising agents. So natural raising agents mean these are naturally occurring in nature. These are not man-made. Now the second type of raising agent is chemical raising agents, right? These are man-made, right? Made in a lab. And there is tons and tons of chemical raising agents, depending on the scale of baking you're doing, whether you're baking at home or you're doing large commercial baking. But in this video, I'm going to keep it very simple. I'm just going to be talking about the two chemical raising agents that most bakers use while making cake. That's baking powder and baking soda, right? Now, please know you can use them for cookies. You can use them for pancakes. But basically, most of the time, we use them for cake making. When it comes to these two raising agents, especially when it comes to beginner bakers, people do tend to be confused about both of them, especially if you haven't been trained formally by a professional baker, whether in an in-depth online class or hands-on classes. So you need to realize that you cannot interchange them. They are actually two separate products. They are similar, but they're definitely used in different ways, and you need to know that. So let me start with baking soda. So baking soda is a base, right? Is actually an alkali. Remember when we were in class and the teacher used to talk about acids and alkali and pH levels, right? So baking soda itself is a base, right? It's an alkali product. So for it to work efficiently, it needs two things. It needs an acidic ingredient and it also needs moisture. So for example, if you have milk in there, if you have eggs, the moisture is there. Now for it to work efficiently or effectively, one of the ingredients in your cake recipe has to be an acid. Now this can be lemon juice, it can be vinegar, it can be something like buttermilk, which is highly acidic, or natural cocoa powder, which is also acidic. And if you guys need me to do a video on the different types of cocoa powder, let me know. So your baking soda can only be used in a cake recipe that has moisture, right? Which most cakes are going to have. They're going to have the eggs or they're going to have the milk. And they also have to have something that's acidic. The other thing I want to mention about baking soda is that it has different names. So most brands are going to write baking soda on it, but sometimes their brands are just going to write something like bicarbonate of soda or sodium bicarbonate. So it's important to note that it has multiple names when it's being labeled by most brands. Now let's talk about baking powder. When it comes to baking powder, it is usually made of baking soda and a dry acid and a stabilizer. So usually baking powder actually has baking soda in its ingredients, and then it has a dry acid, something like cream of tartar, right? And then a stabilizer, most of the time, something like cornstarch. That is why most products tend to use baking powder, like pancakes or most cookies or most cakes, because it actually kind of have like this nice 0 pH level. So all it needs is heat and moisture. Once you add milk or your eggs inside your cake, it's good to go. And once it's put in the oven, the heat, it's ready to work. So that's why you find if you don't have excessively acidic ingredients in your cake recipe, you really don't need baking soda. You can just use baking powder. So now when it comes to the actual baking, you might be asking, when do I use baking soda, right? So you want to use baking soda in a cake recipe that has highly acidic ingredients. So again, this is something like natural cocoa powder, not the Dutch process or the alkalized one. If you're using buttermilk, if you're in Kenya using something like mala, or if you're using yogurt, these are highly acidic ingredients. Now the best possible scenario, to be honest, is for you to be using tried and tested recipes. These are recipes that have been tried and tested by a professional baker, which means that you don't have to worry about that, right? So like, for example, you can get my Baking with Amari recipe ebook that has 58 cakes, cookies, breads, and basic frostings, and then you don't have to worry about, should I use baking soda, should I use baking powder? Or if you were trained by a professional baker, like hands-on class, or in my 6-month in-depth class, you don't have to worry about, when do I use it, because already it's explained in the recipes. However, maybe you are getting a recipe for the internet, maybe you're tweaking a recipe that you've been given. If you're not sure about whether you should be using baking soda, research if the ingredients you're using have an acidic element. Maybe you're looking in there, you've seen baking soda, but you're not seeing an acidic thing. You can literally, here's a tip, you can literally search on Google or ChatGPT and just ask, is this and this ingredient acidic? Is brown sugar acidic? Is ripe bananas acidic? Just search out to see if all your ingredients are acidic. And if you find there's no acidic ingredient, you can choose not to use it. But you'll notice that most recipes that have baking soda tend to have an acidic element, right? Now, when it comes to baking powder, this one is used for most cake recipes because not all cake recipes have highly acidic ingredients. Like regular cakes like vanilla cake or marble cakes or even just vanilla pancakes, those tend to have neutral ingredients. So because of that, most of the time you will notice that you just need baking powder in the mix. However, I do want to mention that a lot of the recipes have a combination of both. You will have a recipe that tells you to use baking powder, for example, 2 teaspoons, and then a 1/4 teaspoon of baking soda. So when this happens, this means that the recipe has an ingredient that has some acid, right? And when this happens, you can use both of them. Again, the best way to try this is to use tried and tested recipes. But if you're in that experimental stage, you can use both if you find that most of your ingredients are neutral, but you do have an acidic element in there, you can add a little bit of baking soda. Now, just to give a perfect example of one of the cake recipes that tend to use both is red velvet cake, right? Like for me in my recipe, I do have a higher amount of the baking powder and a smaller amount of the baking soda. And this is because as much as it's a butter cake that tends to have neutral ingredients, there's a lot of acidic ingredient, right? So if you have buttermilk itself, that's acidic. Or like in my recipe, when I'm sharing with people, if you want to make a substitute of buttermilk, you can take milk, add some vinegar and mix it up. So that itself, right, tends to be highly acidic. So depending on the recipe, you'll find that some recipes naturally tend to use both of them. Now, there are also recipes that need only baking soda. Now, my best example for this is like cookies, right? Like gingerbread cookies tend to only use baking soda. Or something like some variations of chocolate chip cookies tend to only use baking soda. And that's because you're looking for some result. So something like the ginger cookies, brown sugar is used, right? Which has molasses, which is highly acidic. So that's one of the reasons that you're using that. And also you're trying to get this sort of chewy effect, and baking soda tends to give it that particular texture. So you'll find that some recipes are looking for using baking soda not only just for the rise, right, or to counteract the acid, but also the end result, like getting a chewy cookie, tends to need baking soda in the recipes. So it's important to know that some products will use both, some products will only use one, baking soda or just baking powder. So my tip here for you is that if you see a tried and tested recipe, if you know this recipe is giving you a good result, if your recipe says baking powder, use baking powder. Do not substitute, because there's a reason why that particular one was used. If you saw a recipe with baking soda and you've tested it and it seems to work because there's some acidic ingredient, use only baking soda. If it is a tried and tested recipes, don't interchange them. Use them as you should. However, if you're tweaking or testing recipes, make sure you use this with discretion. You don't want to use a lot of baking soda. It does tend to have an aftertaste. And if you mix and match them, sometimes you'll just get horrible results. My last thing on this is if you use the wrong thing, and this tends to, especially if if it's written baking powder and the person uses baking soda. What happens is when baking soda does not have an acid to counteract it, it tends to have a bitter and soapy aftertaste. So the cake will actually rise. Baking soda will always rise. However, because it didn't have an acid to interact with, what's going to happen is that you're going to find that people or you yourself will tell you, hey, that cake was a little bitter. That cake had a soapy aftertaste. And that's because that baking soda didn't have that acid to interact with. So that's why you want to be careful. Use what you're supposed to use, because if you use the wrong thing, you might get a bad result. Another thing is that if you don't have baking soda and you're supposed to use it in a recipe, you might find that that recipe doesn't quite rise. It does get a little gummy or a little sticky if you were supposed to use baking powder and baking soda and you didn't. So the texture might suffer. It might not be as fluffy as it's supposed to be. So remember, use the ingredients as stated. And if you're experimenting, please consider all the things that I have mentioned. Alright, now I'm going to share the bonus tip that I promised earlier, right? Maybe you're a beginner baker or hobby baker. You've had that baking soda or that baking powder for over a year and you're not sure if you should actually use it. So I'm going to share with you guys exactly how I check if my baking soda or my baking powder is good to go or is still active so that I am very confident when I'm baking my cakes. As a baker, did you know that there are different types of flours you can use when you're making your cakes or even breads? So I want you to watch the next videos to see the different types of flours you can use in your baking.